Hey YouTube, it's your girl Kat and I'm back again today. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you all for being here. Today I'm going to talk about emotional flashbacks, CPTSD, and how they both relate to birth moms and how that trauma can affect your adoption reunion as well. So let me get started with my intro. My name is Kat Davald. I'm a 47-year-old birth mom, and I have been in reunion with my 31-year-old daughter for 3.5 years now. So this one was really hard to do. When I was doing the research for this topic, it took me a couple days to get through reading all the articles. I had a lot of epiphanies and realized that my trauma goes further than just giving up my daughter for adoption. By the time that had happened, giving up my daughter for adoption, I was already severely damaged, but I didn't realize it. So I went through a lot of realizations during the research of this topic. I'm not going to go too much into that part of it because I want to focus on reunion. But as I go through this topic, I will have a few tidbits that are unrelated to adoption, and they are my trauma. It will just be there to give you an idea of, different types of trauma that may come up for you as well. But please believe me when I tell you, I sobbed learning about this and realized so many more things about myself. It was eye-opening and really cathartic as well, so don't get me wrong. What are emotional flashbacks? Okay, before we get into that actual definition of emotional flashbacks, I first have to define CPTSD for you, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, so that you can understand how they relate to each other. So PTSD occurs after a single event, such as a car accident or an assault, while CPTSD occurs after a repeated trauma. And this trauma usually happens during childhood when a child is forced to deal with some type of sexual or physical abuse or emotional or physical neglect, parents who are constantly fighting or are unstable, or there's constant change in the household, like moving and all that kind of disruption. So children in these situations will generally develop traits like excessive reliance or heavy independence. Also, buried emotions and wary of relationships in general also can happen. They have an insecure attachment to their caregivers and no way to show their pain, and they also most of the times don't believe in themselves. This is CPTSD. Now, emotional flashbacks are an adult symptom of CPTSD. Because CPTSD happens during childhood, this is an adult symptoms. It's basically reliving the past trauma without realizing it because it's so ingrained in you. Feelings of overwhelming sorrow, shame, inadequacy are common during an emotional flashback. And emotional flashbacks also differ from regular flashbacks in that during a regular flashback, you relive the trauma and remember people and places, things, that type of thing. Sights, smells, sounds, feelings. That's a regular flashback. During an emotional flashback, you don't remember that type of stuff. Buried feelings come to the surface and have us saying and doing things that are a reaction to our past trauma. So it's very subconscious. Emotions, rather than senses, are at play instead during an emotional flashback. For example, you have a caregiver and a child, okay? Doesn't matter if it's a parent, foster parent, sister, aunt, uncle, whatever. The caregiver to the child says something along the lines of, you're always late and you take forever getting ready. You're so stupid and you'll never change. So the child buries this. That's trauma. That's emotional trauma, verbal abuse. The child grows up and becomes an adult. She's 5 minutes late to a meeting at work, let's say. And she'll come in and say something like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm 5 minutes late. I can never get my act together. I'm so sorry and I'm so stupid. That type of stuff. Okay? So she goes back and says what the caregiver had initially said to her all those years ago, and now it's ingrained in her, so she's reliving it. That's an emotional flashback. I do this type of stuff to myself all the time. Anyways, moving on. I want to tell you a little bit about emotional flashbacks and the brain and how they work together. So now how this affects the brain is very interesting, okay? But we need to get into a little bit of medical terminology, but I promise that I will make it as easy to understand as possible. So basically, traumatic events hurt the area of the brain that give it the ability to calm down from a potential new danger. Let me go a little bit deeper. So there are two parts of the autonomic nervous system. It's abbreviated ANS. One part is called the sympathetic nervous system. The other is the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with fight or flight responses and the cortisol releases into the bloodstream. So basically like adrenaline as well, okay? On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system controls the sympathetic nervous system by limiting the stress chemicals that are released, okay? And it shifts it into a more relaxing, digesting, and regenerating state. They're meant to work together in tandem, alternating between each other to support things like good sleep and a healthy immune system and good digestion. But when a traumatic event occurs in the form of child abuse, these two systems stop working. They stop working together, and it leads to problems later in life. Okay? During an emotional flashback, because your ANS is out of sync and damaged, triggers that you get, what your brain perceives as danger, creates a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Okay? Those 4 responses I will talk about a little bit later because I just want to finish up this subject here. Okay? So triggers turn on the sympathetic nervous system, which releases the cortisol into our bloodstream and give us this response. Okay? But what doesn't happen is the parasympathetic nervous system does not turn on because you have a damaged ANS. Okay? I hope that makes sense and it's easy to understand. So the parasympathetic is the calming part of the ANS, and because that doesn't turn on, you are perpetually stuck with this fight or flight, freeze or fawn response. Now, I don't want this to seem as if somebody will withdraw and hide as if it's a conscious reaction. It's not. You're not stuck in like a depression or anything like that. This is totally subconscious. And you don't realize that you're doing it until you're told. Like, I didn't realize that I did this until I did this research. It's kind of part of the reason why I broke down so badly when I was doing it, because I never realized these little things that I did were a result of what I had been through. I mean, I kind of knew, but I really didn't. Anyways, let me go on. So, just as an interjection here, I want to add in another little bit of medical terminology. So CPTSD has not yet been added as an official diagnosis, okay? The concept's been around for quite a long time, and it's very well known in the psychological, psychiatric community, okay? But the actual diagnosis is not in their medical book, and I forget what the name of it was, the medical book. The actual diagnosis is PTSD. However, for the sake of differentiating during this video, I'm going to continue with CPTSD as the trauma associated with the emotional flashbacks rather than PTSD. So I just wanted to make that little disclaimer just in case there's any confusion about it, and if anybody in the medical field is watching, I do want everybody to know that I know the difference, and make you aware as well, just in case you go to talk to your therapist or anybody about it, so you can understand that there is a difference, that you wouldn't be diagnosed with CPTSD, it would be PTSD. So moving on, now I want to talk a little bit about how CPTSD and emotional flashbacks affect the birth mother, and how we were traumatized, like the trauma that we went through during it. So I want to give you some examples of the CPTSD that causes the trauma for us birth moms, and giving these examples will allow you to see the connection between us and the emotional flashbacks. So I'm going to list them off right here. The first one is sexual abuse. Then we have emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, mental abuse, domestic abuse, human trafficking, living as a prisoner of war, living in a war zone, and surviving a concentration camp or internment camp. Those will all give you CPTSD rather than PTSD, because they're all ongoing forms of trauma. CPTSD forms when a child feels like they're in a situation that they cannot escape. And how many of us birth moms were children when we had our babies and when we gave them away or had them taken from us? How many of us were kids ourselves? How many of us pushed our emotions deep down inside to survive? How many of us were told we shamed the family and we were troubled or fallen or morally bankrupt or some other kind of craziness? I was told all kinds of different things. I was told I'd be a statistic and I was just going to have more kids. Many of us were told that we weren't worthy or good enough to raise our babies, that they would have a better life with somebody else. How many times did somebody tell me that? And they still tell me that. They tell me that I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it myself. I was only 15. I couldn't have raised a baby at 15. Why? Why? People do it now. People did it 100 years ago. Why all of a sudden in 1990 was I not good enough to have a baby? I digress. How many of us were told we were selfish if we kept our babies? And how many expectant moms are told that now? In my birth group, that's one of the biggest, not birth group, birth mom group. One of the biggest things that these newer moms are always saying is, I was told that I'd be selfish, that, I if I were to keep my baby, or they're saying that they just think that. Like, yeah, it would be selfish for me. I was selfless to give my baby up. Everybody says you're selfless to do that and brave. No. I don't feel that way. So I would hazard a guess that most of us, or at least a lot of us, were subject to this mental and emotional abuse when we were young. This was coercion and type of abuse. And it could potentially be the subject to emotional flashbacks as well. So now I want to talk a little bit about symptoms that you're having emotional flashback, so that you can identify it after going through that list. Maybe you don't realize it, but you could possibly be having an emotional flashback. So some of the symptoms are feeling overwhelmed, nervousness, disassociation, feeling underwater, anger, emotional detachment, avoidance of activities, people, or places, physical tremors, racing heart, muscle tension, sweating, stomach upset, fear of abandonment or rejection, fogginess, memory loss, and lost time. I can tell you that I've experienced being overwhelmed, nervous, angry, emotional detachment, avoidance, muscle tension, sweating, stomach upset, fear of rejection, memory loss, lost time. A lot of those I experienced. And it's crazy for how 47 years I thought that this was all normal. And during reunion, especially in the beginning, some of these symptoms came back with a vengeance. And I've read countless posts in my Facebook group by women that have just entered reunion and they're so scared. They fear rejection. They fear saying the wrong thing. I feared that. They fear doing the wrong thing. Some want to avoid it altogether, just complete avoidance. Feeling sick and overwhelmed are just two of the adjectives that are used so often to describe how they feel. And now I see the correlation with emotional flashback and how one feels in reunion. And while I'm well past these feelings, I still thought that they were just a normal thing. And it's honestly, it's probably because emotional flashbacks don't have a visual or memory component to them. People rarely realize that they are triggered or relying or reliving trauma from their childhood. And I didn't up until now. So in an article by a gentleman named Pete Walker, he's the director of the Lafayette Counseling Center, and he has 30 years of medical experience. This is where I got a lot of this information from his article, but he created these 13 steps to help you move through an emotional flashback, which I'll discuss later. But I wanted to give you this quote because it was a real wow moment for me. So he states, when they, the triggered individual, recognize that their sense of overwhelm initially arose as a normal instinctual response to the traumatic circumstances they begin to shed the belief that they are crazy, hopelessly oversensitive, and are incurably defective. And this is so true, because as I was researching this, I totally had that realization that it wasn't me. So I get it. That's why I say it's such a wow moment. All this time, all these little things that I did and felt, they weren't me. They weren't who I was actually supposed to be. And it was overwhelmingly healing to figure this out. And it did take me a long time. With that said, if one doesn't have the ability to learn this information, then they continue on with this dysfunctional, potentially self-harmful defenses. And that's scary. You know, that if I had never learned this, then I would, just continue on. But I want to get into those defenses as well, because I mentioned them just a little while ago. And that was the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn defenses. Okay? So, when you fight, okay, your fighting defense is over-asserting yourself in a narcissistic way, kind of like misusing your power or promoting self-interest, something along that lines. Flight would be immersing yourself in something. So obsessively compulsively into activities such as like work, being a workaholic, or maybe a sexaholic, love addiction, or maybe even substance abuse, which those people would go for uppers like cocaine because they need that rush, okay? Then you have the freeze defense, which is numbing and dissociative ways like sleeping excessively, over fantasizing, tuning out with TV or medications. And those would be downers, things like alcohol and weed and Percocets, like pills and stuff like that, because they want to, go to sleep. And then you have fawning, and that would be like codependent in self-absorbing ways, such as putting up with narcissistic bosses or abusive partners. And this has got me written all over it, because I'll tell you a little story right now where I completely dealt with the wrong work environment. Like, 3 of these I totally was. I was freeze, fawn, and flight. So flighting, I would sleep the days away, and just goodbye. Okay, freezing. The freezing is the one where you sleep the days away. Flight would be what I'm doing now is over obsessively working on everything. But I do enjoy it, so it's kind of not that bad. And I'm getting better at telling myself, no, I need downtime. So I am getting better at that. And then fawning. So let me tell you this quick little story. I've been a bartender for 25 years. I recently left 4.5 months ago. And I'm not going back. I'm done with bartending. That was the end of the road. And I've worked in every gamut of type of place you could imagine. So at this one place that I worked at, it was a strip bar. And it was great money and everything, but it was mentally taxing. The woman that I worked with behind the bar, I one day asked her, am I doing a good job? And she said, I can't tell you. And I was like, what? You can't, tell? There's nothing, you don't see my work ethic or anything? She's like, no, I'm just not allowed to tell you. I can't tell you if you're doing a good job or not. And that was a mind freak, if anything. And then another time, I was sick. I literally had the flu. And they told me to wake the F up and drink some coffee. And, I was sick. I was literally sick. Coffee's not going to do anything for me. So I ended up leaving there. I only worked there for a year, which was a year too long. I don't know how I lasted that long. But it was definitely mentally taxing. And I put up with it for a long time. And there's so much more that happened at that place. But I won't go into it. So anyways, do you do this as a birth mom? Do you have any of these symptoms? Do you fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Have you done any of these or have any of those symptoms? Because maybe you're having an emotional flashback. And has it been more frequent since reunion? Mine was my whole life and not realizing it. So now I want to get into managing the inner critic and the emotional flashbacks. And I want to read this other quote from Pete Walker, the gentleman that I mentioned before, and from his article on psychotherapy.net about the inner critic. He says, when the child with complex PTSD eventually comes of age and launches from the traumatizing family, she is so dominated by feelings of danger, shame, and abandonment that she is often unaware that adulthood now offers many new resources for achieving internal and external safety and a healthy connection with others. She is unaware that a huge part of her identity is subsumed in the inner critic, the proxy of her dysfunctional caregivers, and that she has had scarce room to develop a healthy self with an accompanying healthy ego. As I sat here contemplating this quote, I realized one of my inner critics that I had never thought of before. So this is where I tell you a little bit about my trauma that is not associated with adoption. So my father was an alcoholic and would frequent bars after work and not come home until late. My mother would pack my sister and I into the car and drive around to the bars. Okay. Once we got to the bar where his truck was, my mother wouldn't take the initiative to go in and get him herself. But she would make me and my sister, or sometimes one or the other, go in and get him. And I hated doing that. It was so uncomfortable. I hated doing it. So imagine being 7, walking into a bar and having to search your father out. Let me pause here with that story because I had another realization, and that was that I know now that my mother is non-confrontational. And she's non-confrontational to a fault, okay? She just does not like want to argue or anything. She shuts you down for everything. So this was her being non-confrontational, but because she wanted to be non-confrontational, she was putting her insecurities on us kids to handle. So I had 2 epiphanies in one. Anyways, when I grew into adult and my friends would say to me, like, meet me at such and such a place, I would cringe. I hated walking into a place and having to search out for familiar faces. I hated not having someone next to me that I could like banter with while searching so I don't feel like I'm being stared at, or they can do the searching and they find the people. And if I didn't have somebody, then I always had to have something in my hand. And that something was always a cigarette. It doesn't matter if I had just put a cigarette out. Before I got out of the car, I would light a cigarette because at this point, when I was young and dealing with this, you could still smoke in public places, especially bars. So I would make sure that I had a lit cigarette going in so I could be doing something. I don't know. I always felt awkward and like everybody was staring at me. I hated it. And I never put these things together, but that must be why. Why else would I hate something like that? And it was such a realization that these feelings are actually caused by something, and it wasn't me being weird. You know? I just always felt like, why am I like this? So later in life, I became a bartender, and it pretty much went away because I had to go up to strangers and introduce myself, and you're a bartender, you're front center right in the bar. So, but if I go into places, I still feel awkward. Like, I don't really like it. But doing the Uber Eats, that's helping too because I just gotta go in and ask, so. But being a birth mom, I see these similarities too, with the trauma from that. It's just a realization that I came to during this research. So I wanted to share so that if you have any type of traumas, maybe you can look into yourself and see yours too. So that's why I wanted to share that information with you, because sometimes we don't realize things until we hear a little story or something like that. So I wanted to get into managing the inner critic now. And there's 2 ways you can manage the inner critic, and you want to stop that inner critic from talking to you. One is called thought stopping, and the other is called thought substitution. Thought stopping is like seeing a stop sign in your head and yelling no at it, but it's all in your head. You don't want to yell it out loud or anything. People look at you a little crazy. Thought substitution would be changing those thoughts into something more positive about yourself. Okay, so I do thought substitution a lot more. I change things, give myself affirmations, you're not stupid, you're really smart, that type of stuff, rather than the thought stopping. So these two ways of stopping the inner critic are also part of Pete Walker's 13 steps to manage emotional flashbacks. Okay, and I'm going to run through the 13 steps right here. And if you're interested, you can check out the article and read a little bit more about them. They give like a little blurb after each one to go a little bit more in depth on them. So the first one is say to yourself, I'm having a flashback. Okay. Second one is remind yourself, I feel afraid, but I'm not in danger. The third one is own your right or your need to have boundaries. Fourth is speak reassuringly to the inner child. Fifth is deconstruct eternity thinking. Number 6 is remind yourself that you are an adult in an adult body with allies, skills, and resources to protect you that you never had as a child. Number 7 is ease back into your body. Fear launches us into a heady worrying or numbing and spacing out. Number 7, ease back into your body. Fear launches us into heady worrying or numbing and spacing out. Number 8, resist the inner critic. And this is where those two that I just discussed, the thought stopping and thought substitution, come into play. Number 9, allow yourself to grieve. Number 10, cultivate safe relationships and seek support. Number 11, learn to identify the types of triggers that lead to flashbacks. Number 12, figure out what you are flashing back to. And finally, number 13, be patient with a slow recovery process. It takes time in the present to become unadrenalized and considerable time in the future to gradually decrease the intensity, duration, and frequency of flashbacks. Okay, Thomas Seeger, PhD, so Dr. Thomas Seeger, he also wrote an article about flashbacks. And I found this one super helpful too. His direction was a bit different than Pete Walker's. And Dr. Seeger is also very knowledgeable about CPTSD and was familiar with Pete Walker's 13 steps. So Dr. Seeger said, I found Walker's recommendations are helpful for managing the emergency, but do little to prevent the future flashbacks. And I can definitely see what he means. So as I've gone through this research, those 13 steps are definitely for an emergent use. I can see how they would work in an emergency when you're in the middle of a flashback. Therapy would help prevention, but not everybody has the means for therapy or the desire. I, for one, don't. I don't knock therapy or people who go to therapy, but it isn't for me. I do a lot of my own therapeutic stuff, which a lot of people say that's not helpathy and stuff, but I'm not medicating myself. I do research. Anyways, so, and I really honestly think that it stems from the therapy that I got from the adoption agency. So I kind of, am a little bit weary of any type of therapy because that was coercive therapy. But I digress, and I'm moving on. So Seeger found Walker's steps good for emergent prevention and not future. So he developed his own 4-step process for that very use. Okay? The first one is acknowledge the flashback. The second is identify the past experiences of the flashback. Number 3, respond to the question, what problem was I confronted with as a child that might have created these flashback feelings? And number 4 is decide what problem you really want to solve. Okay, so those are Dr. Seeger's 4 steps. And as I went through and wrote those all down, I realized that that's exactly what I just did with me going into my little stories that I just spoke about and everything like that. While I know I didn't speak too much about birth mothers or adoption today, please realize that this topic has a lot to do with trauma that we experienced as children when we had our babies and we had to give them up for adoption. So the gaslighting, the verbal abuse, the mental abuse, we all had to handle that, you know. I mean, we not all, but the majority of us, okay? The coercion and the bullying by the adults in our lives. Some of you may also have had dysfunctional childhoods before your pregnancy, like I did. So this topic might really resonate with you even more. So I made this topic because I really wanted to help people that might need to look a little bit deeper. Because who hears about stuff like this? Nobody hears about emotional flashbacks and stuff like that. So regardless of why you're watching, I hope that this video has helped you. And if you are going through some painful trauma, please know that I am sitting with you. And I'm going to link the articles down below that I used in this research, just in case anybody wants to do any further reading for themselves, okay? That's all for today, YouTube. I hope you have a great day. Let me know any comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.